Now, uncertainty and interdependence react in a very interesting way.
Okay.
And this is called second-order effects.
Okay.
So if you make a change in a tightly coupled system, that change cascades, right? It affects other things. Okay? And each of those changes to those other things affects other things, and those changes affect other things that affect other things.
Okay.
That's partly why it's called a cascade. It just goes all the way down.
I got it.
Okay, so cause and effect. That effect causes other effects and vice versa. So there are second and third and fourth and fifth order effects due to a single change. Okay, which is why in a complex system, sometimes you change something that seems small, seems insignificant, but the ripple effects from that change can often have huge consequences to the system at large.
That maybe you didn't intend to.
Right.
Yeah.
So, sometimes a good example of this, and sometimes the second order effects run contrary to the reason why you made the change to begin with. Okay, good example of this is the policy of rent control on apartments in New York City. And, as a policy, this was something that was instituted with noble intentions. There were a bunch of veterans that were returning from the world wars and needed someplace to live. And they thought, what better way to do this than to, institute a policy of affordable housing where, there would be, lower than market priced rents. And then those rents would not be increased. So these people could have, a nice place to live, as they were getting back on their feet, entering back into the economy after being overseas for so long. Sounds good, right? I mean, who's against, affordable housing for people who have, fought and died?
Right. No, it sounds fabulous.
Yeah, it sounds good. Well, not died. They wouldn't need apartments then, but you know what I mean. So sounds good. Sounds honorable. What actually happened, this was the second order effect. Rent-controlled apartments, okay, because the landlords of those buildings were not able to bring in as much money, their costs did not decrease.
Right.
Okay, it still cost but about the same as it takes to run an apartment building in New York, which is to say a lot. Okay? And because they weren't bringing in what the market would bear, sometimes they only had just enough to compensate them for their effort. And what happened is what they couldn't do is invest that money back into the building to make it better, to make it more desirable, to do all of these things that would improve the value of the property, because they would basically be sinking their money and they wouldn't get anything out of it. There was no return. And so what they did was they refused to
keep the buildings up.
Pay upkeep on the building. Maintenance, repairs, all of these things. And what happened was these buildings that were rent controlled, eventually became, really horrible. Some were condemned. Some of them still exist and they're horribly run down. And so, that's an effect, these rundown buildings. But when the building becomes run down enough that nobody can live in them anymore, what that does is the building shuts down and all of a sudden there's less of a supply of apartments in the area. So because there's more demand in the surrounding area, prices actually go up.
Right, the opposite.
In the non-rent controlled buildings. And so the policy of making affordable housing actually created the opposite of making housing less affordable. That's a second order effect. Same thing happens. This was interesting when I was taking a real estate class in college. We looked at the same thing happening actually when a government or municipality buys a bunch of buildings and destroys them in order to put up a huge public housing complex. So, they'll buy up all of this land that's usually apartment buildings anyway, or houses or whatever, and they'll destroy them to decrease the amount of land, or to decrease the amount of supply in the market.
Right.
The people who are living there will move to the outside, so there's more demand for houses in the area, which pushes up rents, which makes it less affordable. And then because the owners in the surrounding area know that a housing project is going up in a particular area and that they aren't going to be able to sustain these high rents, they don't upkeep the surrounding area. So then all of these other, buildings become old and decrepit, and then
it's messy.
The second order effect goes absolutely contrary to what the initial plan is.
Okay.
So this is one of the trickiest things about dealing with complex systems.
Yeah.
A change that you make because of the interdependence, because of the uncertainty and how things interact can actually create effects or things that you did not expect.
Yeah.
And those effects can be sometimes the complete and polar opposite of why you made the change in the first place. And so this is why complex systems and making changes to them is not a subject to be trifled with.
Yeah.
These second order effects can be quite serious.
I know that those are two really good business examples. Tell the example about Bahrain, because this is a really crazy one.
Oh, yeah, this is weird. Okay, so we actually, this past year, went to visit the Middle East. We were invited to a wedding in Bahrain. And one of the interesting things is that it's just, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's a tiny little island nation that is...
in the middle of the Persian Gulf.
In the middle of the Persian Gulf, just to the east of Saudi Arabia, connected to Saudi Arabia via a bridge. And it used to be, they claim that it is the site of the mythical Garden of Eden. Like it used to be, for being in the Middle East, it used to be a very lush, green island.
And we hear even to like 15 years ago.
Right.
Not that long ago.
Till not that long ago, exactly. And it is now a desert. Completely.
Pretty much,
I mean, it look on Wikipedia, or we have some pictures we can send you. It's desert. There's very little greenery there. And there's a reason for that. And I don't remember who told us this or who told us this story. But there was a policy, Bahrain is an island. They weren't, so they were trying
really
to,
small island.
they're trying to develop, as much, they actually have a lot of skyscrapers. It's actually a very developed place, in Manama, which is the city. But they were running out of land to build the stuff on. And so they had this idea of, we have all of this, dirt. Well, why don't we take the dirt from the center of the island and shift it to the outside so we can actually build ourselves more coastline. We can make our island bigger.
They called it reclaiming land.
Yes, land reclamation. And so they would basically shift all this dirt and they would build more land, and then they would build these huge buildings on top of it in the city. Which, if you have the money to fund it, it's like, well, maybe cheaper, more effective to do that than to, buy a bunch of the surrounding land or build it in a less attractive place. Right. And so they did this for a number of decades. Now, what they didn't expect was by this process of land reclamation, dumping all of this dirt into places where no dirt existed before, they actually unexpectedly interfered with the network of underground springs that actually supplied the fresh water that made Bahrain a lush island, not a desert. And in most instances, they actually cut off that natural water supply.
And they couldn't figure out how to fix it.
And they couldn't fix it. And so this policy, they thought they were doing a good thing by, building essentially cheap land for economic development. What they did was basically devastate
all the springs,
the springs in the ecosystem of the island. So, complex systems, particularly things you don't understand that well,
they're everywhere.
They're everywhere, and the interventions or the changes that you make to a system can often have very large, very serious, very far-reaching effects that are really important. And so, this is the general rule of a complex system is don't mess with things you don't fully understand. And in most cases, particularly for uber complex systems like environmental forces, entire markets, you can actually do a lot more damage to the system by making a change than by not doing anything. Which is why, personally, and we're lapsing a little bit into politics here, but this is part of the reason why I tend to favor not making drastic changes in a very dynamic, complex marketplace, because you don't know what the second order effects will be. You can look at the housing crisis, and you can look at, a lot of the things that we're going through right now as the second and third and fourth and fifth order effects of policies that were instituted decades ago.
Yeah.
Same thing happens, to the environment. The whole idea of, seeding the oceans with iron to, cause bacteria to bloom to capture all sorts of carbon dioxide sounds good in theory. It's the second and third and fourth and fifth order consequences of that may prove that to be not such a good idea.
We'll see.
So, we're kind of ending this week on a down note a little bit, because, complex systems are complex. They're hard to understand. They're hard to figure out. They're hard to predict. And a large part of learning how to deal with systems effectively is to really internalize the reality of that. There's no magic bullet. There's no, mental model that can give you the ability to always make systems do what you want them to do.
But in the next 2 weeks, we are going to learn concrete things that can at least help you make things better.
Absolutely. So what we're doing is we've kind of set the stage
Yeah.
for understanding systems. What we're going to talk about going forward is how to actually look at a system and break it down and understand how it works as best as you're able. And then, importantly, how to improve the system without blowing things up, which second order effect would say really, really important. So hope you've enjoyed this very basic introduction to systems, and more coming soon.